Shalom, and welcome back to another episode of Ezra International's It's All About the Aliyah. You know, for over 25 years now, Ezra International has been helping the poorest of the poor Jewish people make it home to the land of Israel, the land of their biblical destiny. It's called Aliyah, and it really is all about the Aliyah. Hi, I'm your host, Gary Christofero, and today's program, I'm going to do something I did in the previous program, dedicate this whole show to those who died on a place called the Road of Death in Moldova. And if you haven't heard of the Road of Death, don't worry, you're not alone. But just like in 1941 in Kiev, Ukraine at Babi Yar, in July of 1941 in Moldova, the final solution was being carried out, and almost nobody knows about it. You could look it up online. You could try to find history of that, and you won't find it. But thank God for the eyewitnesses, and thank God for our representatives who have shared this story with me, and I will share it with you. You might ask, what do the tragic events of the Holocaust have to do with Aliyah? Well, everything, really, because there was no one there to help in the day, in the 30s and the 40s, when the worst of the Jewish history was taking place. Today, we want to make that different. Today, Ezra International is dedicated to helping the least of these, the poorest of the poor Jewish people who need our help getting out of countries who are notoriously anti-Semitic, and there are very few people there to help them. So that's what we're all about. Before we get into our story about Moldova today, I want to give you a quick update about Belarus. If you recall, again, if you followed this show often, I did one of our country profiles on a place called Belarus. Now, if you'll notice, we work in places that most people probably don't pay a lot of attention to. Today's program, Moldova, the country profile I did about Belarus, how many people pay attention to the events there? But God is working because He's regathering His people from the ends of the earth. And He's working in places that get very, very little attention in our media in today's news. But on September 23rd of this year, Belarusian security forces began detaining people and firing water cannons to disperse crowds because thousands of people took to the streets in Minsk once again because the president, Alexander Lukashenko, he held a quick inauguration service, even though the election has been contested for about 6 weeks. Now, if you need a reminder, Alexander Lukashenko has been president in Belarus for decades, and he held an election and claimed that he received 80% of the vote. Now, that's pretty impossible almost anywhere, but especially in a country where he is so unpopular. He claimed 80% of the vote, and so the protests about the illegitimacy of that election have been going on now for many weeks. And then he decides he will hold a quick inauguration service without announcing it. And of course, the protests erupted into a greater magnitude. Now, what is the importance of Belarus? Well, as I told you, there are Jewish people living there, and that's why it's important to Ezra International. Why is it important geopolitically? Well, Belarus matters to Russia because it's a buffer state between NATO and Russia, the Russian border. It's also a conduit for the Russian exports of oil and gas. So this is why, as I mentioned in our first episode regarding Belarus, that it remained to be seen how the sides would be drawn. And of course, NATO and the European countries are condemning what's going on there. But Vladimir Putin did decide to stand with Lukashenko, and in fact granted him a $1.5 billion loan, and decided also to hold Slavic Brotherhood defense exercises in Belarus. This is to show a strong hand and support the president and try to intimidate those who are protesting. So We're keeping a close eye on what's happening there because it will affect immigration, but of course the Aliyah, getting Jewish people out of Belarus, is our priority. So we're keeping a close eye on the situation there, and I'll give you further updates as they become available. You won't hear about Belarus probably in most of your media, so come here and we'll keep you updated. All right, Moldova. Where in the world is Moldova? Moldova is bordered on the west side by Romania, and it's bordered on the north, east, and south side by Ukraine. If that gives you some idea about the country, it's a very small country. And speaking of Ukraine, Moldova has a situation going on there that's very similar to what's brewing or ongoing in Ukraine. In Ukraine, it's still actively, there's an active disputed territory. In Moldova, it's quiet and agreed upon. But what I'm talking about is on the border of Ukraine, we have the Donbass region where Russian separatists are trying to pull away from Ukraine, and they would rather be part of Russia. And that area has been disputed now for about 6 years. In Moldova, there's an area called Transnistria. There's a river that runs through Moldova, the Dniester River, and on the west side is Moldova proper. On the east side of that river, up to the Ukrainian border, is a place called Transnistria. It's also known as the Pridnestrovyan Moldovan Republic, and it is not recognized by the United Nations, but it is recognized by Moldova as a autonomous region, autonomous zone. And so they because they felt that they would rather have been part of the Soviet Union and did not want to break away from the Soviet Union when Moldova declared its independence. So that's the situation in Moldova currently. How did the Jewish people get there? They arrived in Moldova, the region that we now know as Moldova, back during the time of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. Remember, Rome controlled the region that Israel is in as well, known then only as a province of Judea. And Jews had been scattered, so they reached the area of Moldova. I want to go back and remind us all, because if you have not been following this program regularly, you might be wondering what are we talking about when Jews were scattered? Jews have been dispersed from their own land twice. You know, remember Isaiah 11:11 says, "I will regather them a second time." That is because twice Israel has been scattered. Once we know it, the first one we know as the Babylonian captivity. The temple was destroyed. The Jews were sent into captivity. 70 years later, they returned to Israel. That was the first return. During the time of the Roman occupation, eventually Jerusalem was sacked. The temple was destroyed a second time in 70 AD. The final revolts were put down about 60 years later. But from that time forward, Jews were pushed out of this region and went to the four corners of the earth for almost 2,000 years, and then began to return to the land of Israel. This is the second return. And it's the second return that we are still the privileged generation to be witnessing. You know, they came back in smaller increments initially when the region was still known as Palestine. We did an entire episode regarding that. You can go back and look at that, the history of the region of Palestine, never a state. But we're living in the day that are fulfilling the words of Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah 16 verse 14 says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that no longer will it be said that the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, but the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands where he had driven them. For I will bring them back into their land, which I gave to their fathers." 2,700 years ago, Jeremiah makes this promise, makes this prophecy of God. And we're the blessed generation to be actually witnessing the fulfillment of it before our eyes. And because it's speaking of the land of the north, I will go to another chapter of Jeremiah, chapter 31, verse 8. Behold, I will bring them from the north country. Remember, places like Ukraine, Russia, and even Moldova, almost due north of Israel, the north country, the former Soviet Union countries, is what is being spoken of by the prophets when they say, behold, I will bring them back from the north country. And I will gather them from the ends of the earth. So it's not limited to the north country, it's from all over. Among them, the blind and the lame, the women with child, and the one who labors with child. Together, a great throng shall return there. And as I've told you before, we have witnessed these things throughout history. Women being born on the Ethiopian airlift, women giving birth to children on the Ethiopian airlift. Children coming in, more people got off the plane than went on. We've helped the lame and the blind in our work on a daily basis. They shall come with weeping and supplication. I will lead them. I will cause them to walk by the rivers of water in straight way, in which they shall not stumble. And I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. And I continue to read because I want to read this declaration, because I'm speaking over Israel TV network to many nations. And the word of the Lord says, Jeremiah 31, verse 10, hear the word of the Lord, O nations. I'm speaking to you, O nations, wherever you are in the world. I'm speaking to you, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, he who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. So I am fulfilling the command here of Jeremiah to declare in the nations, as I'm going out through these airways, across the internet, to all the nations around the world, that the God who scattered Israel will regather her, and he is. We're witnessing it before our very eyes. Okay, let's talk about the road of death. It's a sad story once again, and I have a letter here from our representative, Igor, in Moldova. And our reps, I'm telling you, our reps are the greatest people on earth. You won't read about them in the newspapers. They're not great superstars in Hollywood or in sports, but they are superstars in the economy of God. I believe that. They love the Jewish people, and they're doing the work on the ground every day. And he tells his story, and thank God, because now I know it and I'm sharing it with you. Most of the world is unaware of the events that happened in July of 1941 in Moldova, but now you will know. And I will quote his story. I'll pull to the best of my ability here from his own words so that you hear it as clearly as possible. Moldova is a small country. He says you can drive around the whole country in one day. There are many roads in this small country. Some of them are called international, some of them are called Republican, and some local. All these roads can be measured in kilometers, all but one. He says, but there is one road which cannot be measured in kilometers, and that is the road called the road of death. This is something not taught in schools or universities. You won't hear about it on the radio or in television programs. You can Google it and you won't hear any information. You won't get any information. And I tried. You won't. But such a road does exist. And I wanted to learn more about it in order to tell, first of all, my children, then my church, and also those reading these lines. And now you who are hearing it through my voice. In order to get this to this road, you need to drive 250 kilometers from Chisinau, the capital of Moldova. And then he goes on to talk about the order that went out on July 17, 1941. The order that was to the creation of camps for Jewish people, euphemistically called temporary detention camps. In fact, they were for the mass murder of Jewish people. And he says, to be frank, generally speaking, the brutality of the Romanians in many ways exceeded that of the Germans. Local people remember the kind of all kinds of occupations, but particularly that of the Romanians. And then he goes on to speak of where they stopped alongside the road, and there are memorial stones. And they speak of the things, the atrocities that happened there. And one of the things that happened there was the eyewitnesses saw the Germans or the Romanian soldiers stab a baby. They took an infant from the arms of a young, beautiful woman, stabbed the baby, threw it into a pit, and then proceeded to rape this beautiful young woman, and then killed her and also threw her into a pit. This is the horror that happened along this road. He goes on to speak of the process that the Germans were using. He says, on the road of death, the Jewish people were deceived and then killed. No one knew, even suspected, that it would lead to their death. Throughout the entire road, the Nazis arranged temporary detention camps in towns and villages. The Jewish people were told they were being transported to better places that would get them good jobs and new places to live. There were witnesses who say the Jewish people stubbornly refused to believe that they were being led to their deaths. Remember, at Babi Yar, they didn't want them to know because they felt they might flee and that would make it harder. So they deceived them all the way to the end. On the appointed day, the whole procession began to make its way across the Dniester River. They were marching, the Jewish people, in procession. But before the main column, the Nazis, along with Romanian soldiers, forced the local people to dig huge ditches every 25 to 30 miles. When the main column got to those points, they were allowed to rest and eat if they had anything. They were deceived into believing they were allowed to rest and eat. Then they were told to continue on as soon as, they said, then those who were too weak and too tired were asked to stay and wait for a cart to transport them. As soon as the crowd of people disappeared over the horizon, all the remaining people were executed and dumped into ditches. So right to the end, they deceived them. They thought they were going to be transported. The rest of the column moves on, and then they were shut down, executed, and thrown into the ditches that the locals had to dig for them. I'm sorry to bring this type of stories to you, but I think it drives home the importance that we help the Jewish people today. And with that, we're going to pause right here for a short commercial, and I'll be right back.
On the 26th day of September 1941, the following order was posted. All Yids of the city of Kiev and its vicinity must appear on Monday, September 29th by 8 o'clock in the morning. Bring documents, money and valuables, and also warm clothing, linen, etc. Any Yid who does not follow this order and are found elsewhere will be shot. September 29th and 30th of 1941 marked one of the largest massacres of Jewish people in the history of the Holocaust. Kiev, Ukraine Jews were ordered to report and believed that they were going to be relocated, yet they were stripped of their belongings and then of their clothing. They were marched into a ravine 150 meters long, 30 meters wide, and 15 meters deep. Most victims could not have known what was happening until it was too late. By the time they heard the machine gun fire, there was no chance of escape. Over 33,000 Jewish people were massacred at Babi Yar. Nearly 80 years later, Ezra International remembers the tragedy at Babi Yar in Kiev, Ukraine. Anya was saved by her mother, who gave her fake documents to escape just before the massacre, and Ezra International helped Anya finally make Aliyah to Israel. You can help us return the poorest of the poor Jewish people to their biblical homeland. Only $30 per month for a year can make the dream of Aliyah a reality for one Jewish person. Call the number below or go to EzraInternational.org. and stand with us as we say, never again.
Okay, before the break, I was talking about the road of death, and I'm giving you an account by one of our representatives in Moldova. He and his family, some of his family members, a friend who was a historian, and her daughter were along with them. And the daughter of the historian actually was so moved by what she saw here that she cut and sold her hair to contribute to the monies that was being collected for a memorial stone that was placed along this road of death. The Nazis mockingly called this road the road of life, but as we know, it was quite the opposite. Just to conclude the letter from Igor, I want to read the last words of his letter to me. People who do not remember the past are poorly oriented in the present and have no idea about the future. Let's travel together, be silent, pray, and remember. One last thing. Igor's grandfather lived in one of these villages along the road of death, and that's why he is so well informed, and his grandfather was one of the eyewitnesses to these events. Never again. We must make it a reality. Ezra International is attempting to make never again a reality because Jewish people are still living in these notoriously anti-Semitic countries around the world. There was 350,000 Jewish people living in the region known as Moldova today that died in ghettos and along this death march. Post-World War II, things obviously got a little bit better, but not much for the Jewish community. They still faced many hardships, including being forbidden to practice many of the Jewish traditions because the Soviet Union took over this region and imposed communism. In 1961, bar and bat mitzvahs were banned. And then later, in 1992, civil war broke out in Moldova. This, again, causing Jewish people to have to flee. And the Federation of Jewish Organization of Communities in Moscow and in Israel organized evacuations and helped get many of the Jewish people out. But this civil war is where we see the separation of Moldova on the west side of the Dniester River, and then the what was called the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic of Transnistria, and we know it today as Transnistria alone because the Soviet Union collapsed. But this is the violent and disruptive past of Moldova, of this region that we are witnessing. And today, there are just over 4 million people living in Moldova, with about 20,000 Jews still remaining. Why is it so important to get this remaining 20,000 Jewish people out? Because the vast majority of the population it practices Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which I told you in the past is a very anti-Semitic replacement theology church. And we really do need to get the remaining Jewish people out of Moldova. We have helped approximately 1,900 of these folks get out, but there are more to help, and we're going to need your help in doing that. And I want to remind you of our calling, Ezra International's calling. First of all, Isaiah 49, verse 22 says, "Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will lift up my hand in an oath to the nations." Again, speaking to us in the nations. "And set up a standard for my people. They shall bring your sons in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders." That is the call that Ezra International is answering. The idea that the Jewish people would have help from the nations to carry them out of these nations. Literally, in some cases, when it comes to the lame, we are, and the children, we have carried them in our arms, literally fulfilling the call of Isaiah 49, verse 22. And then I want to talk to you again about the words of Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, our Messiah. You may know him best as Jesus. I often use his Hebrew name, Yeshua. But the context of his words of Matthew 25, I'm going to once again remind you, they come from Joel chapter 3. The prophet Joel says, behold, in those days at that time, speaking of a future date, when God would bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem. As I've mentioned before, we're the generation that's witnessing that return. Then he goes on to say, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have also divided up my land. Now we know the division of the land is had been an ongoing peace process until recently. So we know it's talking about today. And he also says that the judgment is on account of my people, my heritage, Israel. He makes it very clear. So when we read the words of Yeshua in Matthew 25, verse 31, and he says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne of glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them as one from another, as a shepherd divides sheep from the goat. He's talking about the same judgment that Joel spoke of. And he says he will set the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And then Yeshua goes on to talk using language that we would read also in Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. God said to Abraham, those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. And I believe it is still a promise today for those who bless or curse Abraham's descendants. He goes on to say, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, feed you, and thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick and in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. The least of these. Moldova is the poorest country in Europe per capita, and we're helping the poor, the Jewish people who are the poorest of the poor amongst the poor. Moldova is the poorest of the poor country in Europe per capita. And so we need to be there and help them. And Yeshua goes on to say, if you do not do these things, he says, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do one of these things, the least of these, you did not do it to me. I believe that our mission is at the very heart of God in helping the poorest of the poor Jewish people get out of their situation and get home to Israel. And we are giving you an opportunity to come alongside us and help us in that mission. The Jews of the world are looking for you and I to help them out of their situation so that we can make never again a reality and not just a slogan. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope that what I'm saying to you is touching your heart and that you will respond by going to our website, EzraInternational.org, and do what you can. God bless you. Shalom. We'll see you next time.